My name is Trooper David Walker, Texas Department of Public Safety, Highway Patrol Division, badge number 5794. I spent 32 years patrolling the highways of Texas, from the pine forests of East Texas to the endless desert stretches out west, from the Gulf Coast to the Panhandle. But it's what happened on Interstate 35 between Austin and San Antonio during the summer of 2001 that ended my career and still wakes me up at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, reaching for my service weapon that isn't there anymore. Before I get into what really happened that night, I need you to understand something. If you're watching this while driving, especially if you're on I-35 anywhere between Austin and San Antonio, pull over. I'm serious. What I'm about to tell you might save your life. And if this story resonates with you, if you've seen things on that stretch of highway that didn't make sense, hit that like button and subscribe. Not for me, but because there are other stories, other warnings I need to share about Texas highways that aren't what they seem. Drop a comment with your location. I'm curious how many of you are watching from Texas right now. Because if you are, you need to know the truth about what moves through our state after dark. Texas highways are different from other roads. They're arteries connecting cities that shouldn't exist, crossing distances that break people's minds if they think about them too hard. Drive from El Paso to Beaumont, and you'll cross 880 miles of Texas, passing through desert, mountains, plains, forests, and swampland. That's further than driving from New York City to Jacksonville, Florida. And in all that space, in all those empty miles between cities, things exist that we don't talk about in official reports. I grew up in a small town called Castroville, just west of San Antonio. My daddy was a rancher, my mama a school teacher, and I was supposed to follow in Daddy's footsteps until I saw a DPS recruiter at a career fair my senior year of high school. Something about that uniform, that badge, that responsibility for keeping people safe on the highways, it called to me. I joined up right after graduation in 1969, went through the academy in Austin, and started my career patrolling the hill country highways around Fredericksburg and Kerrville. For the first 20 years, it was everything I'd hoped for. I helped stranded motorists, investigated accidents, caught speeders and drunk drivers, saved lives. I met my wife Sarah at an accident scene. She was an emergency room nurse who'd stopped to help before the ambulance arrived. We raised 2 boys, both of whom became teachers like their grandmother. Life was good, predictable, safe. The strange things I occasionally saw or heard about, livestock mutilations, lights in the sky, drivers who swore they'd lost hours of time on empty stretches of highway. I dismissed them as tired minds playing tricks or attention seekers making up stories. That changed in the summer of 2001. It had been a brutal summer, with temperatures hitting 110 degrees regularly and no rain for 2 months. The heat made the asphalt shimmer like water, creating mirages that turned the highway into something that looked almost alive, breathing in the scorching air. Accidents were up, tempers were short, and even veteran troopers were making mistakes from heat exhaustion and dehydration. I was working the night shift out of the new Braunfels station, patrolling the section of I-35 between San Marcos and San Antonio. It's a heavily traveled corridor, especially on weekend nights when college kids from Texas State are heading to San Antonio for the clubs and bars. But that Tuesday night in July was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you nervous after 30 years on the job. The traffic was lighter than it should have been, even for a weeknight, and the vehicles that did pass seemed to be moving faster than usual, like they were trying to get through that stretch of highway as quickly as possible. It was just past 2 a.m. when I got the call. Dispatch reported multiple motorists calling in about a vehicle stopped in the middle of the southbound lanes near mile marker 188. No hazard lights, no visible driver. This wasn't unusual. People run out of gas, cars break down, sometimes drunk drivers just stop in the middle of the road. But something about the dispatcher's voice, a slight tremor that suggested she was hearing something in those calls that worried her, made me respond with more urgency than usual. As I approached mile marker 188, I saw the vehicle, a white Ford Expedition, maybe 5 years old, stopped perfectly centered in the middle lane. No hazard lights, just like dispatch had said, but the engine was running. I could see the exhaust in my headlights. I positioned my patrol car behind it with my lights on, creating a safety buffer for the traffic that would eventually come through, and approached the vehicle cautiously. The windows were tinted, but I could see the driver's silhouette still seated behind the wheel. I tapped on the window with my flashlight, following standard procedure. "Sir? Ma'am, this is the Texas Highway Patrol. You need to move your vehicle." No response. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch at the sound of my knocking. I tried the door handle. Unlocked. That should have been my first warning. In 30 years of highway patrol, I'd never encountered an abandoned vehicle with the engine running and the doors unlocked. I opened the door, and the smell hit me immediately. Ozone, like the air after a lightning strike, mixed with something metallic and wrong. The driver was a middle-aged man, probably mid-40s, wearing a business suit. He was sitting perfectly upright, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, eyes wide open and staring straight ahead. But he wasn't breathing. I checked for a pulse, nothing. He was dead. But there were no visible injuries, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just a dead man sitting in perfect driving position with his foot still on the brake. I called it in, requesting backup and an ambulance, though I knew the ambulance wouldn't be needed except to transport the body. While I waited, I examined the vehicle more carefully. The radio was on, but producing only static. The GPS showed the vehicle's location as somewhere in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, which was impossible. We were 150 miles inland. The odometer was running backward, the numbers decreasing as I watched. And in the back seat, I found something that made my blood run cold. There were 4 more people, a woman and 3 children, all seated properly with their seatbelts on, all dead, all with the same wide-open, staring eyes. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they were all completely dry except for their hair, which was soaking wet and smelled like salt water. In the middle of Texas, during a drought, 150 miles from the nearest ocean, these people's hair was dripping with seawater. I stepped back from the vehicle, my hand instinctively going to my service weapon. Something was very wrong here, something that went beyond a medical emergency or even a crime scene. The air around the expedition seemed thicker than it should be, and I could swear I heard something. A sound like distant whale songs, impossible but unmistakable. The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath becoming visible despite it being July in Texas. That's when I saw the other vehicles. They were appearing out of nowhere along that stretch of highway, materializing like mirages in reverse. A sedan here, a pickup truck there, all stopped in the middle of the road, all with their engines running. Within 5 minutes, there were 7 vehicles scattered across the southbound lanes of I-35, and I could see more appearing in the distance. I got on my radio, trying to call for immediate backup, for them to shut down the highway, but my radio was producing the same static as the expedition's stereo. My cell phone showed no signal, which was impossible. We were between 2 major cities, with cell towers everywhere. I was cut off, alone on a highway that was becoming something else, something that shouldn't exist. The sound of whale songs grew louder, and now I could hear something else underneath it. Voices, hundreds of them. Speaking in a language that sounded like drowning, the asphalt beneath my feet began to ripple like water, and I had to grab onto my patrol car to keep from falling. The vehicles that had appeared were all empty now, their doors hanging open, but wet footprints led from each one toward the median. toward something I couldn't see but could feel building in the darkness. I've faced armed suspects, high-speed chases, fatal accidents that would give anyone nightmares. But standing on that stretch of I-35, watching reality bend and break around me, I felt a terror I'd never experienced before. Because this wasn't something I could arrest, couldn't shoot, couldn't call for backup to handle. This was something else entirely, something that suggested everything I thought I knew about the world, about Texas, about the highways I'd patrolled for 30 years, was wrong. The temperature continued to drop, frost forming on my patrol car's windshield despite the July heat that should have been radiating from the asphalt. The whale songs were deafening now, and I could see shapes moving in the darkness beyond my headlights. Massive things that shouldn't exist on land, shouldn't exist at all. The wet footprints from the vehicles were glowing faintly, a phosphorescent blue-green like deep-sea creatures, leading toward a point in the median where the air itself seemed to be tearing. I made a decision that probably saved my life, but haunts me to this day. I got back in my patrol car, threw it in reverse and floored it, backing away from whatever was happening at mile marker 188. As I retreated, I saw them in my headlights, people, dozens of them, walking out of the tear in reality. They were soaking wet, their clothes from different eras, some in modern dress, others in styles from the 50s, 40s, even what looked like 1920s attire. They moved wrong, like they were still underwater, fighting against currents that didn't exist on dry land. Among them, I saw the family from the expedition, the man, woman, and 3 children, walking hand in hand toward something I couldn't see. The man turned to look at me as I backed away, and his eyes were no longer human. They were black, completely black, like the deepest parts of the ocean where light never reaches. He smiled, and water poured from his mouth, impossible amounts of it, flooding onto the highway that was 150 miles from any ocean. I backed up for nearly a mile before I could find a gap in the median to turn around. As I fled north on I-35, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the impossible. A massive wave, hundreds of feet tall, rising from the highway where those vehicles had appeared. It hung there defying gravity, defying logic, filled with shadows of things that swam through it. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, it collapsed, vanished, leaving nothing but empty highway behind. When I finally made it back to the New Braunfels station, the sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that looked too normal, too peaceful after what I'd witnessed. My sergeant, Bill Patterson, took one look at me and immediately pulled me into his office. I must have looked like hell. My uniform was soaked with sweat despite the frost I'd seen. My hands were shaking, and I could still smell salt water even though I'd never gotten close to whatever that wave had been. "Walker, what the hell happened out there?" Bill asked, closing the door behind us. "We lost radio contact with you for 3 hours. The dispatcher said your unit just disappeared from the GPS tracking." 3 hours. It had felt like 30 minutes at most. I told Bill everything, knowing how it would sound, knowing he'd probably order a drug test and psychological evaluation. But I had to report it, had to create some official record of what had happened. Bill listened without interrupting, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "David," he said finally, using my first name, which he never did on duty. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Have you been drinking, taking anything? This heat's been brutal, and heat stroke can cause hallucinations. Send units to mile marker 188. I interrupted. "The vehicles will still be there. The expedition with the family, the others. Send units now." Bill studied my face for a moment, then picked up his phone. 20 minutes later, we got the call back. There were no vehicles at mile marker 188. No evidence of any incident. The highway was clear. traffic flowing normally. But the officer who checked the scene mentioned something odd. The asphalt at that exact spot was newer than the surrounding road, as if that section had been recently repaved. And there was salt residue on the road surface, enough that he could taste it in the air. Bill ordered me to take a week off, mandatory rest, and strongly suggested I see the department counselor. I didn't argue. I needed time to process what had happened, to try to make sense of it. But I couldn't let it go. On my own time, using my own resources, I started investigating. The first thing I did was check missing persons reports along the I-35 corridor. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past 50 years, there had been 347 unexplained disappearances along the stretch of I-35 between Austin and San Antonio. Not all at once, but spread out, usually 1 or 2 people at a time. Vehicles found abandoned with no trace of the occupants. And here's the thing that really got me. They clustered around certain dates. Every 9 years, almost to the day, there would be a spike in disappearances. 1956, 1965, 1974, 1983, 1992, and now 2001. I dug deeper, going through old newspaper archives at the San Antonio Library. I found articles dating back to the 1920s, before I-35 was even built, when it was just the old San Antonio Road. Even then, there were stories of travelers vanishing along that route, of strange lights seen at night, of people claiming to hear sounds of the ocean in the middle of the Texas hill country. One article from 1929 caught my attention. A Texas Ranger's report of finding a wagon train that had disappeared 3 days earlier. The wagons were empty, but everything was soaking wet, and there were what he described as barnacles of a type found only in deep ocean waters, attached to the wagon wheels. I tracked down retired officers who had worked that stretch of highway, bought them beers, and listened to their stories. Most hadn't seen anything as dramatic as what I'd experienced, but they all had tales of odd occurrences. Drivers found in a catatonic state, unable to explain how they'd gotten from Austin to San Antonio with no memory of the drive. Vehicles that appeared on radar moving at impossible speeds, only to vanish when units responded. Reports of rain falling upward, of radio signals picking up what sounded like ship-to-shore communications from vessels that didn't exist. One retired trooper, Miguel Sanchez, told me something that chilled me to the bone. He said his grandmother, who had lived in the area all her life, used to tell stories about the land where I-35 now runs. She claimed it was built over an ancient seabed, that millions of years ago it had been the bottom of an ocean that had covered most of Texas. But she also said that some places remember what they used to be, that the past doesn't always stay buried. She warned that every 9 years, when the conditions were right, the old ocean would try to reclaim its territory. I thought it was just folklore until I consulted with a geology professor at UT Austin. He confirmed that, yes, that part of Texas had indeed been underwater during the Cretaceous period, part of the western interior seaway that had split North America in two. The limestone bedrock throughout the hill country was formed from the compressed remains of ancient sea creatures. But when I asked if there was any scientific explanation for what I'd experienced, he laughed and said the past was the past, that geology didn't work that way. But I knew what I'd seen, and I wasn't the only one. On July 18, 2001, exactly 1 week after my encounter, I got a call from a trucker named Carl Morrison. He'd gotten my number from a mutual acquaintance who knew I was investigating strange occurrences on I-35. Carl was hesitant at first, afraid I'd think he was crazy, but eventually he told me his story. He'd been driving his 18-wheeler northbound on I-35 around 3 a.m., hauling a load of produce from the Rio Grande Valley to Dallas. Just south of New Braunfels, his CB radio started picking up strange transmissions. what sounded like maritime distress calls. Ships reporting their positions, requesting immediate assistance, giving coordinates that would have put them right in the middle of the highway. Then his truck's engine started sputtering, which made no sense as he'd just had it serviced. He pulled over to the shoulder, and that's when he saw them. Ships, actual sailing ships, moving across the highway like it was water. They were translucent, like mirages, but detailed enough that he could see crew members on the decks, could read names on the hulls. One passed so close he could smell tar and salt water. The ships moved through the traffic without affecting it, cars and trucks passing right through them as if they existed on different planes of reality. But here's the detail that made me know Carl was telling the truth. He said he saw a white Ford Expedition among the ghost ships, floating like a boat, with a family inside all staring straight ahead with black eyes. The same vehicle, the same family I'd encountered a week earlier. Carl's encounter lasted about 10 minutes before everything returned to normal. But when he checked his truck's GPS log later, it showed that during those 10 minutes his truck had somehow traveled 73 miles, an impossible distance for the time elapsed. The produce in his trailer had aged weeks in those 10 minutes, most of it rotting beyond salvage. His employer fired him, thinking he'd somehow scammed them, but Carl knew something impossible had happened on that highway. I started mapping all the incidents, all the disappearances, looking for patterns beyond the 9-year cycle. What I found was that they all centered around specific mile markers: 188, 179, 170, 161, and 152. 5 points along a 36-mile stretch of highway. When I connected them on a map, they formed a perfectly straight line. But more interesting was what lay beneath them. Each point sat directly above an underground water source, aquifers, underground rivers, limestone caves filled with water. It was as if these water sources were serving as conduits for something. I consulted with Dr. Patricia Vance, a professor of theoretical physics at Rice University who had a side interest in what she called temporal anomalies. She was one of the few academics willing to even discuss the possibility that what I'd experienced was real. She had a theory that certain geological conditions could create what she called temporal thin spots, places where past, present, and future weren't as firmly separated as they should be. Imagine time not as a river flowing in one direction, she explained, but as an ocean with currents moving in many directions at once. Most of the time, we only experience one current, the present. But in certain places, under certain conditions, those currents can cross, can overlap. You might experience the past superimposed on the present, or even catch glimpses of potential futures. She believed that the limestone bedrock, the underground water, and possibly even the electromagnetic fields generated by the traffic on I-35 could combine to create these temporal thin spots. The 9-year cycle might correspond to solar activity, magnetic field fluctuations, or other cosmic factors we didn't fully understand. It was all theoretical, of course, but it was the closest thing to an explanation I'd found. On August 2nd, 2001, I made a decision that would change everything. I assembled a small team of people who had experienced anomalies on I-35. Carl, the trucker, a college student named Jennifer who had lost 3 hours driving that stretch and had video evidence of her car's clock jumping forward, and surprisingly, Bill Patterson, my sergeant, who admitted that he'd been collecting reports of strange incidents on that highway for years but had never known what to do with them. We decided to conduct our own investigation, to be on that stretch of highway during what we calculated would be the next incident. Based on the patterns I'd identified, we predicted something would happen on August 13, 2001, exactly 1 month after my initial encounter. We equipped ourselves with cameras, both video and still, electromagnetic field detectors borrowed from a paranormal investigation group in Austin, and a variety of other recording equipment. On the night of August 13th, we positioned ourselves at mile marker 179, one of the 5 points I'd identified. Carl was in his personal vehicle with a dash cam. Jennifer had multiple cameras set up to capture different angles. Bill and I were in my personal truck, loaded with equipment. We waited, watching, ready for anything. At 2:47 a.m. it started. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Our breath became visible. The EMF detectors went haywire, needles spinning wildly. The static on our radios formed patterns, almost like voices trying to break through. And then we saw them. Lights beneath the highway, as if the asphalt had become transparent and we could see water flowing underneath, illuminated by some phosphorescent source. The highway began to undulate, gently at first, then more pronounced, like ocean swells. Cars that passed through the area seemed to flicker, existing in multiple positions simultaneously. We saw their drivers' faces change, aging and growing younger in rapid succession, as if we were seeing them at different points in their timeline. Then the first ship appeared. It rose from the highway like it was breaching the surface of the ocean, a Spanish galleon with full sails, cannons visible on its deck. It was solid enough that when it landed back on the highway, we could hear the crash of wood on asphalt. More ships followed, modern yachts, fishing vessels, even what looked like a World War II submarine. They moved through our reality like ghosts, but ghosts that could affect the physical world. Jennifer's cameras captured it all, or so we thought. When we reviewed the footage later, most of it was corrupted, showing only static and strange patterns. But a few frames survived, enough to prove we weren't all having a collective hallucination. Those few frames showed something that shouldn't exist. The highway transformed into an ocean, complete with waves, and ships from across history sailing through modern traffic. The footage we managed to salvage should have been enough to convince anyone that something extraordinary was happening on I-35, but when we tried to share it with authorities, we were met with silence, dismissal, and in some cases, threats. The Department of Public Safety ordered Bill to cease his unauthorized investigation immediately or face disciplinary action. Jennifer's professor at UT told her she'd fail her journalism degree if she published anything about the incidents. Carl was visited by men in suits who claimed to be from the Department of Transportation, but showed credentials no one could verify, warning him to keep quiet about what he'd seen. But we couldn't stop. Not when we knew that people were disappearing, that families were being torn apart by something that officially didn't exist. We formed what we called the I-35 Watch Group, meeting secretly, sharing information, trying to understand the pattern, and maybe find a way to prevent future incidents. Through my law enforcement connections, I managed to access sealed records from the Texas Department of Transportation dating back to the construction of I-35 in the 1960s. What I found there was disturbing. The original survey team had recommended routing the highway 3 miles to the west, avoiding the area where the anomalies occurred. But their recommendation was overruled by state officials who insisted on the current route. The reason given was cost-effectiveness, but handwritten notes in the margins of one report told a different story. They want it built here, one note read. The old families insist. Something about maintaining the covenant. I tracked down the lead surveyor from that project, Thomas Hartley, now 89 years old and living in a nursing home in Fredericksburg. His mind was still sharp, and when I mentioned I-35 and the strange incidents, his eyes widened with a mixture of fear and relief. "Finally," he said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Someone who might believe me." Thomas told me that during the initial survey in 1962, his team had experienced numerous equipment failures along the proposed route. Compasses spun wildly, surveying equipment gave impossible readings, and 3 team members reported having the same dream, of being underwater, looking up at the surface where modern Texas should be, seeing the shadows of massive creatures swimming overhead. But the strangest part was when they tried to drill core samples. At 5 specific points along the route, the same 5 points I'd identified as anomaly centers, they couldn't drill deeper than 30 feet without their equipment being destroyed. Not broken, destroyed. Metal drill bits came up twisted into impossible shapes. Some partially transformed into what looked like coral or other organic material. Thomas said he'd recommended avoiding those points, but then received a visit from a group of men representing what they called historical preservation interests. They showed him documents dating back to the Spanish colonial period, land grants that specified that any major construction in the area had to pass through those 5 specific points. It made no sense, but they had the legal authority to enforce it. They told me, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a whisper, that the road had to be built there to maintain something they called the Maritime Compact. They said it was older than Texas, older than America, maybe older than human memory. They said if we didn't build it there, something much worse would happen. This led me to the Texas State Archives, where I spent weeks combing through Spanish colonial records. My Spanish wasn't great, but I found references to El Camino del Mar Antiguo, the road of the ancient sea. Spanish missionaries in the 1700s wrote about indigenous peoples who insisted that certain paths had to be maintained, roads that followed invisible currents in the land, or else the waters that were would reclaim the lands that are. On September 10, 2001, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a journal, handwritten in multiple languages, Spanish, French, English, and something I couldn't identify. The English sections were dated from the 1850s and appeared to be written by a Texas Ranger named Samuel Coleman. His entries described encounters with what he called temporal tides along what would eventually become the I-35 corridor. Coleman wrote, "The Comanche speak of times when the old waters return, when the sky touches the earth in the wrong way, and past and present become confused. They avoid these places except when the covenant must be renewed. Every 9 years, they say, sacrifices must be made to keep the waters sleeping. Not blood sacrifices as we understand them, but sacrifices of time, of possibility. People taken not to die but to exist between what was and what is, holding the boundary in place." The journal included a map, hand-drawn but incredibly detailed, showing the 5 points along what would become I-35. Each point was marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change even on the static page. Next to each symbol were dates, stretching back centuries, all following the 9-year pattern I'd identified. September 11th changed everything. The attacks in New York and Washington dominated the news, and suddenly no one cared about strange incidents on a Texas highway. The I-35 watch group disbanded as people focused on larger concerns. Bill was deployed with the National Guard. Jennifer graduated and moved to Dallas. Carl stopped driving that route, taking lower-paying jobs to avoid I-35 entirely. But I couldn't let it go. The 9-year pattern suggested that 2010 would be the next major incident, but minor anomalies continued to occur. I documented everything, built a database of disappearances, collected witness testimonies. I also noticed something new. The incidents were becoming more frequent, the anomalies lasting longer. Whatever barrier existed between our reality and the ancient ocean was weakening. In 2003, I took early retirement from the Highway Patrol. Officially, it was due to stress and PTSD from years of working fatal accidents. Unofficially, the department wanted me gone. I'd become an embarrassment, the trooper who believed in ghost ships on the highway. Sarah, my wife, supported my decision. though I could never tell her the real reason. How do you explain to someone that reality isn't as solid as they think, that the past can bleed through into the present, that an ancient ocean is trying to reclaim Texas? I used my retirement to investigate full-time. I traveled to other places where similar anomalies had been reported. A stretch of Route 66 in New Mexico, where drivers reported seeing wagon trains that vanished when approached. A section of Highway 1 in California where the ocean seemed to extend further inland than maps showed. A portion of I-10 in Louisiana where the swamp sometimes appeared to cover the road completely. I found a pattern. All these locations sat on what geologists called paleo shorelines, ancient boundaries between land and sea from different geological periods. But more than that, they were all places where significant transportation routes had existed for centuries, paths that indigenous peoples had used, that Spanish explorers had followed, that American settlers had traveled. It was as if the constant movement of humans along these routes had worn thin the barrier between past and present. In 2008, I was contacted by Dr. Robert Kaufman, a quantum physicist from MIT, who had heard about my research through academic channels. He had a theory that consciousness itself played a role in maintaining the stability of local space-time. The more conscious observers passed through an area, the more real and stable it became. But this process could work in reverse. If enough observers expected or feared something, their collective consciousness could actually affect reality. He believed that the stories and legends about these places, passed down through generations, had created what he called narrative shadows, imprints on space-time that could manifest under the right conditions. The 9-year cycle might be related to solar activity that affected human consciousness in subtle ways, making people more susceptible to perceiving and thereby reinforcing these narrative shadows. This theory took on new relevance in 2010, the next major point in the 9-year cycle. By then, I had identified 17 people who regularly traveled I-35 between Austin and San Antonio and had reported minor anomalies. Clocks running backward, radios picking up impossible signals, brief glimpses of things that shouldn't exist. I reached out to them, warning them to avoid that stretch of highway during the peak period I'd calculated, July 13th to 15th, 2010. 15 of them listened. 2 didn't. Mark and Lisa Patterson, no relation to Bill Patterson, were driving back from Austin to San Antonio on the night of July 14th. They were young, skeptical, and thought my warnings were the ravings of a paranoid old man. Their car was found the next morning at mile marker 170, engines still running, doors locked from the inside. They were gone, but their cell phones were still in the car, and Lisa's phone had been recording video when they disappeared. The video showed the highway beginning to flood, water rising impossibly from the asphalt itself. Mark could be heard saying, "This isn't real. This can't be real," over and over. Lisa was screaming. Then the camera showed something rising from the water. A hand, but too large, with too many fingers, reaching for the windshield. The video cut off there. The phone's memory card partially corrupted by what appeared to be saltwater damage, despite the phone being found completely dry. The Pattersons have never been found. They joined the hundreds of others who have vanished along that stretch of I-35, taken by something that officially doesn't exist. Their families were told they probably ran off together, starting a new life somewhere else. But I know the truth. They're still on I-35, just not in our time, not in our reality. They exist in the space between the ancient ocean and modern Texas, part of the barrier that keeps the two from fully merging. As 2019 approached, marking the next point in the 9-year cycle, I knew I had to do something more than just document and warn. The anomalies were growing stronger, lasting longer, affecting more people. The barrier was failing, and if it collapsed completely, the results would be catastrophic not just for Texas, but possibly for the entire timeline of human civilization. By 2019, I was 70 years old, my body carrying the weight of 5 decades in law enforcement and 18 years of investigating something that officially didn't exist. Sarah, my wife of 43 years, had passed away 3 years earlier from cancer, going to her grave never knowing the full truth about what I'd been chasing all those nights when I told her I was working overtime. Maybe that was a mercy. She died believing the world was solid, predictable, governed by laws of physics that made sense. She never had to know that reality was as fragile as morning mist on the Guadalupe River, that our entire existence balanced on the edge of something vast and incomprehensible. My sons thought I'd lost my mind in retirement. David Jr., who'd become a high school principal in San Antonio, would visit me in my small apartment in New Braunfels with that look of pity and concern that adult children get when they think their parent is sliding into dementia. Michael, my younger boy, who worked as an engineer in Houston, had tried to get me to move into an assisted living facility, convinced that my obsession with the highway incidents was a sign of cognitive decline. They didn't understand that the boxes of documents, the maps covered in red string connecting incidents, the walls covered with photographs of empty vehicles and temporal distortion patterns weren't the products of a deteriorating mind, but evidence of a reality they were blessed not to perceive. The signs that 2019 would be different started manifesting in January of that year. The Comal River, which flows through New Braunfels, began running backward for 3 hours on January 13th. The phenomenon was caught on dozens of security cameras and cell phones, but within days, scientists had explained it away as an unusual hydrological event, caused by pressure changes in the Edwards Aquifer. But I knew better. The river was remembering when it flowed into an ancient ocean, before the land rose, before Texas existed. By March, truckers were refusing to drive the Austin-San Antonio corridor on I-35 after midnight. The official reason was construction and traffic, but the real reason spread through CB radio chatter and truck stop whispers. Drivers were experiencing time slips, arriving at their destinations hours before they should have, their diesel fuel barely consumed, their logbooks showing impossible timestamps. One driver, Marcus Washington, claimed he'd driven from Austin to San Antonio in 7 minutes, his truck's GPS showing he'd maintained a steady 65 miles per hour the entire time. The math didn't work, couldn't work, unless the distance itself had changed. The dreams started affecting people statewide in May. Not just the drowning dreams that had preceded previous convergences, but dreams of Texas transforming. People reported seeing downtown Austin underwater, with prehistoric sharks swimming between the skyscrapers. San Antonio residents dreamed of the Riverwalk filled with bioluminescent jellyfish and creatures that had no names because they'd gone extinct before humans evolved to name things. Children drew pictures of their homes at the bottom of an ocean, with their families swimming to school and work, breathing water as naturally as air. The mental health system was overwhelmed. Therapists reported a surge in patients experiencing shared delusions about oceanic transformation. The state health department issued advisories about mass hysteria, suggesting it was caused by climate change anxiety combined with the stress of modern life. But I knew the truth. The barrier between our reality and the ancient ocean was so thin that it was bleeding through into the collective unconscious of Texas. I reached out to everyone I could find who had experienced or investigated the anomalies. My old partner, Bill Patterson, had died in Afghanistan in 2003, but his son, Will, had followed his father into law enforcement and had heard all of Bill's stories about the I-35 incidents. Carl, the trucker, was 73 now, living in a retirement home in Temple, but his mind was sharp and he was eager to help. Dr. Patricia Vance had become the head of a privately funded research institute studying what she carefully called temporal phenomena, never using words that might trigger academic ridicule or government attention. We assembled what I called the Last Watch, though the younger members preferred the I-35 Temporal Response Team. The name didn't matter. What mattered was that we had people who understood what was coming and were willing to face it. The team was an unlikely mix of believers, scientists, and those who'd been touched by the anomalies. Alex Chen, a 30-year-old software engineer, had developed algorithms that could predict temporal distortions by analyzing cell tower data disruptions. His girlfriend, Maria Gonzalez, was completing her PhD in geology, focusing on the Cretaceous Western Interior Seaway that had once covered Texas. She brought scientific credibility to our observations, translating the impossible into academic language that almost made sense. James Crowfoot represented a different kind of knowledge. A member of the Comanche Nation and a professor of indigenous studies at UT Austin, he had access to oral histories that predated European colonization. His great-great-grandmother had been a keeper of stories about the water roads and the breathing times, when the land remembered its other selves. According to these stories, the convergences weren't random, but followed patterns established when the world was young, when the distinction between land and sea, past and future, was more fluid. We had others too. Jennifer Martinez, the journalism student from my 2001 investigation who was now an investigative reporter willing to risk her career on the story. Dr. Robert Kaufman, the MIT quantum physicist who'd moved to Texas specifically to study the anomalies. Miguel Sanchez, my old colleague who'd retired but couldn't shake the feeling that his grandmother's warnings about the land had been prophecy rather than folklore. My son, David Jr., joined us in June, finally accepting that his father might not be insane after all. The tipping point for him was when his own son, my grandson Tyler, came home from a fishing trip at Canyon Lake with a video on his phone. The video showed the lake suddenly draining, revealing an ocean floor complete with volcanic vents and creatures that shouldn't exist. The lake had refilled within minutes, but Tyler's friend had caught a fish that the biology department at Texas State University couldn't identify. It had organs that didn't match any known species, living or extinct. We established our headquarters in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of New Braunfels, close enough to monitor I-35, but far enough from the 5 critical points to avoid being caught in the initial phase of what I believed would be the final convergence. Alex had equipped the space with monitors showing real-time data from traffic cameras, weather stations, and seismic sensors. Maria had covered the walls with geological surveys showing the ancient seabed beneath central Texas. James had created what he called a temporal map, overlaying indigenous path markers with modern highways, Spanish colonial roads, and theoretical ley lines. By early July, the signs were undeniable. The limestone caves throughout the hill country were flooding with salt water that had no source. The bats at Bracken Cave, the largest bat colony in the world, abandoned their roost en masse, millions of them flying south toward Mexico as if fleeing something. The San Antonio Zoo reported that all their aquatic animals were exhibiting extreme distress, with several species attempting to evolve air-breathing capabilities in real time. Something that should take millions of years was happening in days. On July 12th, the day before I predicted the convergence would begin, something unprecedented happened. Every radio station in Central Texas, from AM to FM to satellite, simultaneously broadcast the same signal for exactly 3 minutes at 2:47 p.m. It wasn't music or voices, but the sound of ocean waves, of whale songs, of something immense breathing. The FCC had no explanation. The radio stations claimed their equipment had functioned normally, showing regular programming in their logs. That night, our team took their positions. I insisted on returning to mile marker 188, where it had all begun for me 18 years earlier. David Jr. came with me, despite my protests. "Dad," he said, "I've spent years thinking you were losing your mind. The least I can do is be here when you're proven right or wrong." We arrived at 1:30 a.m. on July 13th. The highway was eerily empty, as if some primitive part of every driver's brain was screaming warnings to stay away. We parked on the shoulder, setting up our equipment, cameras, EMF detectors, a small weather station, and something Alex had cobbled together that he claimed could measure temporal density, though none of us really understood how it worked. At 2 a.m., the temperature began dropping, but not uniformly. My thermometer read 72 degrees Fahrenheit, while David's, just 10 feet away, showed 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The air itself seemed to be existing at multiple temperatures simultaneously. Our breath came out as fog that rose and fell, as if gravity couldn't decide which direction it was supposed to work. At 2:30 a.m., the stars started moving, not quickly, but perceptibly, sliding across the sky in patterns that violated everything astronomy said was possible. Constellations stretched and compressed. The moon appeared in 3 different positions simultaneously, each one showing a different phase. David grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. "Dad, what's happening?" "Time," I said. "Time is becoming unstable." At exactly 2:47 a.m., I-35 shattered like a mirror dropped from a great height. But instead of fragments of glass, each shard showed a different era. I could see the highway as it was when it was built in the 1960s. Fresh asphalt and hopeful America. I could see it in the 1800s when it was a cattle trail, longhorns and cowboys driving herds north. I could see it millions of years ago when it was ocean floor, teeming with life that had no names. And I could see futures, some where the highway was a tunnel of light, others where it didn't exist at all, where Texas itself was something unrecognizable. The White Horde expedition materialized in all timelines simultaneously. I could finally see the truth about the family inside. They hadn't died in 2001. They existed in every moment of the highway's existence, conscious and aware, experiencing all of time at once. The man's eyes met mine across 18 years and million of centuries, and in them I saw an infinite weariness and terrible understanding. "They're anchors." James Crowfoot's voice came through the radio, though it sounded like it was coming from very far away or very long ago. "The disappeared don't die. They become fixed points, holding the timelines apart, preventing them from collapsing into each other. The water began rising from the highway, but it wasn't water as we understand it. It was liquid time, containing every moment the land had ever experienced as ocean. Through it swam creatures from every era, trilobites and megalodons, things that might have been dolphins if evolution had taken different turns, beings that wouldn't evolve for another million years. They moved through the liquid time like it was their natural medium, which I suppose it was. Then I saw it, the thing that had been trying to communicate through all the convergences. It rose from the temporal ocean like a living mountain, a creature that existed in all times simultaneously. It had features from every era: Cambrian eyes, Jurassic teeth, modern mammalian intelligence, and something else, something from futures we couldn't imagine. It was beautiful and terrible, impossible and absolutely real. It spoke without words, communicating in pure concept that bypassed language and went straight to understanding. The message was complex but clear. Earth was evolving. Not just the life on it, but the planet itself was transitioning to a new form of existence where the distinction between past, present, and future would become meaningless. Humanity had a choice: evolve with it or be left behind in a single timeline that would become increasingly unstable until it collapsed. The convergences hadn't been attacks or accidents. They'd been tests, preparations, gradually exposing humanity to the concept of temporal fluidity. The highway system, built on ancient paths that followed temporal currents invisible to modern science, had become the neural network through which this evolution was being transmitted. Every person who drove these roads was being subtly prepared. Their consciousness slowly adapted to accept multiple timelines. But humanity had resisted. Dehid explained away every sign. Now, the transformation could no longer be postponed. The 2019 convergence wasn't just another incident. It was the beginning of the actual change. The barriers between timelines would dissolve completely within the next decade, unless humanity chose to evolve, to accept temporal consciousness, to become something new. I understood then why I'd been chosen to witness this, why the investigation had consumed my life. I was one of the few who could observe without going insane, who could translate between the old reality and the new. My years of denying, then accepting the impossible, had prepared me for this moment. "Dad," David's voice was strained. "The water's rising." He was right. The temporal ocean was spreading beyond the highway, flowing across the Texas hill country, transforming everything it touched. But things weren't drowning. They were evolving. I watched a mesquite tree cycle through its entire life cycle in seconds, then reverse, then exist as seed, sapling, mature tree, and decayed wood simultaneously. A roadrunner became a dinosaur, then a bird again, then something with iridescent feathers that had never existed in our timeline. I made the decision that would define not just my life, but possibly humanity's future. I walked toward the temporal ocean, toward the impossible creature that waited there. David tried to stop me, but I shook him off. "This is why I'm here," I told him. "This is what all those years led to." As my feet touched the liquid time, I felt myself spreading across decades, centuries, millennia. I experienced every moment of my existence simultaneously: birth and death, youth and age. Every choice I'd made and every path I hadn't taken. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and absolutely liberating. The creature embraced me, and through that contact, I became a conduit between realities. Information flowed through me, not just to the team at the 5 points, but to every conscious mind within 1,000 miles. Some people couldn't handle it, their minds shutting down rather than accept what they were learning. But others, especially children and those who'd already experienced anomalies, adapted quickly. Through me, the entity explained the choice in terms humanity could understand. We could remain in our single timeline, but it would require constant maintenance, regular convergences that would grow increasingly violent. Or we could evolve, accept temporal consciousness, become beings that existed across multiple timelines simultaneously. The disappeared would return, changed but alive, serving as guides for the transformation. The government response was swift and predictable. Military vehicles surrounded the 5 points. Fighter jets scrambled from Lackland Air Force Base, but their weapons were useless against something that existed in all times simultaneously. Bullets passed through the temporal ocean without effect. Missiles exploded in one timeline while remaining unfired in others. Then, something unexpected happened. My grandson Tyler, who'd been monitoring our communications from the warehouse, did something that changed everything. He posted the live feed from our cameras to every social media platform simultaneously. Within minutes, millions were watching the impossible unfold on I-35. The temporal ocean, the impossible creature, my transformation, all of it broadcast to the world. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. Religious groups declared it the end times or the second coming. Scientists demanded access to study the phenomenon. Conspiracy theorists claimed vindication. But most importantly, young people around the world began reporting similar experiences. Brief glimpses of other timelines, momentary temporal displacement, dreams of existing in multiple realities. The convergence lasted until dawn on July 15th, 48 hours of reality being fluid, negotiable, transformable. When it finally ended, I-35 had been fundamentally changed. The 5 critical points remained as permanent thin spots where the barriers between timelines were translucent. The government tried to close the highway, but it was too late. The transformation had begun. I remained changed, existing partially in multiple timelines, aging and growing younger simultaneously, experiencing past and future as present. It's not comfortable. Imagine remembering things that haven't happened yet while forgetting things that are currently occurring. But it's necessary. Someone has to stand at the boundary, helping others through their transformation. The disappeared began returning within weeks, not all at once, but in waves. They were changed, existing in temporal superposition, but they were alive and conscious. The White Ford expedition family, the Andersons, I finally learned their names, were among the first. Robert Anderson became a spokesperson for the transformed, explaining their experience to a world struggling to understand. The government created the Temporal Integration Task Force, officially acknowledging what they'd denied for decades. My son, David Jr., was recruited to lead the Texas division, his experience during the convergence making him one of the few who could work with both normal and transformed humans. The warehouse in New Braunfels became an official research facility, though James Crowfoot insisted on blessing it with Comanche rituals before any government scientists were allowed in. Dr. Patricia Vance's theories were vindicated, earning her a Nobel Prize, though she admitted publicly that the reality was far stranger than anything she'd theorized. Alex Chen's temporal detection app was bought by the Department of Defense for an undisclosed sum, but he released a free version that helped people identify when they were experiencing temporal fluctuations. As I write this in 2024, though I'm simultaneously writing it in 1987 and 2156, the transformation of humanity continues. It's not happening all at once. Evolution never does. But more people are being born with the natural temporal consciousness, able to perceive multiple timelines without distress. Schools are being redesigned to accommodate students who exist in several realities simultaneously. The concept of linear time is becoming quaint, something older generations cling to like rotary phones and handwritten letters. I-35 has become a pilgrimage site, with people from around the world coming to experience temporal fluidity firsthand. The stretch between Austin and San Antonio is now called the Temporal Highway, with warning signs in multiple languages and timelines. The Texas Department of Transportation has had to create new categories of driver's licenses for those who can navigate temporal distortions. My own existence has become increasingly complex. I'm 75 years old and 23 and not yet born. I'm a Texas Highway Patrol trooper who retired in 2003 and never joined the force and hasn't been born yet. I remember Sarah dying of cancer and being alive and never meeting her. It's maddening and enlightening, like seeing a magic eye picture that shows different images depending on how you look at it. But through all the temporal chaos, one thing remains constant: my duty to serve and protect. It's just that now I protect people traveling not just through space, but through time. Help them navigate not just highways, but timelines. The badge I wore for 32 years meant courtesy, service, protection. Now I understand those words in ways the Texas DPS never intended. The ancient ocean still rises periodically, especially during the 9-year cycles, but now we're ready for it. We don't fight it or deny it. We surf it, using the temporal waves to glimpse other possibilities, other realities, other versions of ourselves. Children born after 2019 treat it as normal, the way previous generations accepted automobiles or the internet. There are still those who resist, who insist on maintaining single timeline consciousness. They're not wrong to do so. Evolution doesn't require every member of a species to change. Some remain as genetic anchors to the past, ensuring we don't lose ourselves entirely in the temporal flux. My son Michael is one of them, stubbornly linear, aging normally, living a life that would have seemed ordinary in the 20th century. But for those who've embraced the change, existence has become infinitely richer and more complex. We see the connections between all things, the way past decisions ripple into future possibilities. We understand that death is just a transition to a different temporal state, that consciousness persists across timelines even when bodies don't. The highway I patrolled for 32 years has become a metaphor for human existence, a path that seems to lead in one direction, but actually extends through dimensions we're only beginning to understand. Every driver on I-35 now is participating in humanity's evolution, whether they know it or not. As the 2028 convergence approaches, or has already happened, or is always happening, I know it will be different again. Each convergence builds on the last. Each transformation opens new possibilities. The ancient ocean that once covered Texas is patient but persistent, teaching us through repetition that reality is far more fluid than we ever imagined. If you're reading this in whatever year you exist, know that the transformation isn't something to fear. It's as natural as the evolution from sea to land, from single cells to complex organisms, from unconscious matter to conscious beings. We're simply taking the next step, moving from conscious beings trapped in single timelines to conscious beings who can navigate the temporal ocean as easily as our ancestors learned to walk on dry land. The Highway Patrol motto was right all along, just not in the way we thought. Courtesy to all timelines. Service across all realities. Protection for humanity as it evolves. This is my confession, my testimony, my warning, and my invitation. The temporal ocean is rising. The highways are transforming. Reality is evolving. And somewhere on Interstate 35, between Austin and San Antonio, at mile markers that exist in all times simultaneously, the transformation continues. The white Ford Expedition still drives through every timeline, its occupants serving as eternal guides. The ghost ships still sail through the highway, reminding us that the distinction between land and sea is temporary. And I still patrol, in my way, helping travelers navigate not just the road, but the intersection of all possible roads. Welcome to the new reality. Welcome to temporal consciousness. Welcome to the highway that exists in all times at once. Drive safely. Watch for temporal anomalies. And remember, the future isn't ahead of you and the past isn't behind you. They're both right here, right now, on I-35.